The hum of the television filled the apartment, blending with the rhythmic clicking of buttons. My boyfriend was lost in his game, his eyes glued to the screen, fingers moving in practiced motions across the controller. He hadn't looked at me in the past half hour, completely immersed, unaware of anything else. I stood at the doorway of our shared bedroom, watching him from the shadows. "I'm going to bed," I said, my voice casual, careful. He murmured, not even glancing my way. I lingered a second longer, waiting to see if he would at least turn his head. Acknowledge me. But he didn't. The game had him. And he had no idea what I was about to do. I turned away, stepping inside our room, leaving the door open just a crack. I plugged my phone into the charger by the nightstand, making sure the soft glow of the screen would give the illusion I was still in bed, scrolling like I usually did before sleep. Then, I moved toward the other door. The one that led into the hallway. The air felt heavier as I wrapped my fingers around the handle. My heartbeat pounded, my pulse a steady drum in my ears. I shouldn't have felt this nervous, but I did. Every muscle in my body was tense, charged with something I couldn't name. I turned the handle as slowly as I could, easing the door open inch by inch, careful not to let it creak. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional bursts of sound from the game, distant laughter from his headset, the voice of someone he was playing with. He was too distracted to notice me slipping out. I moved down the hallway, each step deliberate, careful. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet, the dim glow from the television casting faint shadows along the walls. At the end of the hall was another door. I hesitated in front of it, my fingers hovering over the wood. This was the point where I could still turn back. I could still go back to our room, slide under the blankets, and let the sound of his game lull me to sleep. I could pretend this moment never happened. But I didn't want to. I didn't knock. I didn't have to. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark except for the faint light from a laptop screen. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, leaning back against the headboard, shirtless, the glow casting sharp lines over his bare chest, his jaw, his collarbone. His eyes lifted to mine the second I stepped inside. I exhaled slowly, shutting the door behind me. He smirked. "I was wondering when you'd finally come in." The door clicked shut behind me, sealing us away from the rest of the apartment. The sounds of the video game, my boyfriend's occasional murmurs into his headset, all became nothing more than a distant hum. In here, it was just him and me. I leaned against the door for a second, my fingers still resting on the cool metal of the handle. My heart was pounding, my breath uneven. I had crossed the line the moment I stepped out of my room, but standing here, in front of him, it felt more real. More dangerous. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched me, his gaze dark, steady, filled with something unreadable. The glow from his laptop screen flickered over his face, casting shadows along the sharp edges of his jaw. "I wasn't sure you'd actually do it," he finally said, his voice low, almost amused. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "And yet, you left your door unlocked." His lips curled into a smirk. "Because I knew you wanted to." I did. I had wanted this for longer than I cared to admit. It had started as something harmless, passing glances, fleeting moments of tension whenever we were alone, the way his hand would brush against mine when we sat too close. It was never supposed to be anything more than that. And yet, here I was. I took a slow step forward, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. He didn't move, didn't shift away. If anything, his smirk deepened, like he was enjoying watching me struggle with my own hesitation. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave before it was too late. But my body? My body craved the danger. I reached the edge of the bed, my fingers twitching at my sides. He was close now, his scent, a mix of something clean and sharp, mixed with the faintest trace of cologne, curling around me. He tilted his head, studying me like he was waiting for me to make the next move. I did. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down and pressed my palm against his chest. His skin was warm beneath my fingertips, his heartbeat steady, unshaken. I, on the other hand, felt like I was about to come undone. His smirk softened, turning into something else. Something darker. "You're shaking," he murmured. I wasn't sure if it was nerves or anticipation. Maybe both. His hand lifted, his fingers trailing up my arm, slow and teasing. Goosebumps erupted along my skin, my breath catching in my throat. "This is your last chance," he said quietly. "If you want to leave, do it now." I should have. But instead, I slid my hand up to his shoulder, gripping him just slightly. His eyes darkened. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned down, closing the space between us. The moment my lips hovered over his, a new kind of tension crackled in the air, thick, electric, impossible to ignore. My breath was uneven, my fingers digging slightly into his shoulder, as if I needed to ground myself before I lost all control. His hand slid up my arm, slow and deliberate, his fingertips tracing my skin with just enough pressure to send a shiver through me. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting, letting me decide, letting me take the final step. I should have pulled away. Instead, I closed the distance. The kiss started slow, testing, like we were both hesitant to acknowledge what was happening. But the second his lips moved against mine, the hesitation burned away. I tilted my head, deepening the kiss, my hand sliding from his shoulder to the back of his neck, fingers tangling in his hair. He let out a low hum of approval, his other hand moving to my waist, gripping just enough to make my stomach tighten. Heat coiled low in my body as he pulled me closer, his grip firm, possessive. The laptop's glow flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room, making the moment feel even more forbidden, more dangerous. I barely noticed when he shifted, his legs spreading slightly as he pulled me onto his lap, my knees pressing into the mattress on either side of him. The new position sent a wave of heat through me, my body molding against his, every point of contact igniting something reckless inside me. I gasped against his mouth as his hands traveled lower, fingertips skimming the hem of my shirt. His smirk returned, lazy and knowing, as he murmured, "You're really not stopping, are you?" I wasn't. Because in this moment, with his hands on me, his lips trailing heat along my jaw, the sound of my boyfriend still playing his game down the hall. Stopping wasn't an option. The weight of my decision should have hit me the second I pressed my lips to his. It should have felt wrong. I should have thought about my boyfriend, still sitting on the couch, still lost in his game, completely unaware of what was happening just down the hall. But all I could think about was this. His hands, steady and warm, roaming over my waist, his fingers pressing into my skin like he was memorizing every curve. The way he pulled me closer, fitting me against him with ease, like we had done this 100 times before, even though this was the first. I was straddling him now, my knees sinking into the mattress, his hands sliding under my shirt, fingertips grazing my spine. Every nerve in my body was on fire, my breath hitching at even the smallest touch. He smirked against my lips. Still not stopping. I wasn't. I couldn't. I let my hands explore, tracing over his shoulders, down his arms, feeling the solid strength beneath my fingertips. He let me. He watched me. His eyes, dark and unreadable, followed my every movement, like he was trying to see exactly how far I was willing to take this. The answer was obvious. His lips left mine, trailing down the side of my neck, his breath warm against my skin. My head tilted back automatically, giving him more space, my fingers tightening in his hair. Every kiss, every graze of his teeth sent another wave of heat rushing through me. "You're quiet," he murmured against my throat. "Is that because you're scared of getting caught?" I shivered. "Maybe." He chuckled, low and deep. "Or maybe you like it." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. His grip on my waist tightened, his fingers pressing into my skin with just enough force to make me feel completely, entirely his in this moment. The reality of what we were doing, of how reckless this was, made my pulse hammer inside my chest. But I still didn't stop. I reached down, grabbing the hem of his shirt, and with one swift motion, I pulled it over his head, tossing it aside. My fingers traced over his bare skin, feeling the heat radiating off of him, the tension in his muscles as he let me touch, let me explore. His lips found mine again, more demanding this time, more certain. Outside, in the living room, the game continued. The clicks of the controller, the occasional bursts of frustration, the sound of my boyfriend completely lost in another world. And here I was, in another world of my own, wrapped up in his best friend, my body betraying every ounce of common sense I had left. But there was no guilt. Not yet. Because in this moment, all I wanted was more. The reality of what I was doing should have hit me. The weight of it, the danger, the betrayal, it should have made me stop. But the only thing I could feel was him. His hands on my waist, gripping me tighter now, pulling me flush against his body. His breath, warm against my neck as he kissed down the side of my throat, each touch sending heat spiraling through me. His fingers skimming the edge of my shirt, teasing, testing, waiting for me to be the one to take it further. I wanted to. I was already too far gone. My fingers moved over his chest, tracing the lines of his muscles, memorizing the way his body tensed under my touch. His skin was warm, solid, so different from what I was used to. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening. "You're still shaking." I was. My body was betraying me, nerves and adrenaline and anticipation all tangled together. I swallowed hard. "I'm not stopping." A slow, knowing smirk spread across his lips. "I never thought you would." His hand slid higher, pushing my shirt up just enough to expose more of my skin. My breath caught as his fingers moved along my spine, exploring, learning, setting fire to every inch of me. I let out a shaky breath, my fingers digging into his shoulders as I leaned in, pressing my lips to his again. This time, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Only hunger, only need. He groaned into the kiss, pulling me closer, deeper, like he had been waiting for this just as long as I had. A sudden noise from the living room made my body jolt. The game. The controller hitting the coffee table. My boyfriend muttering something under his breath. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears. His hands were still on me, his body still pressed against mine, his breath warm and steady, as if he wasn't afraid at all. As if he was completely unshaken. His lips brushed my ear, his voice a low whisper. "Don't move." I barely breathed as I listened, waiting, wondering if this was the moment everything would come crashing down. But after a few seconds, the sound of the game resumed. I exhaled, my grip loosening just slightly. And then, before I could think, before I could process, he flipped me onto my back, pinning me beneath him, his smirk returning. "We were almost caught," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He leaned in, his lips just barely grazing mine. "And yet, you're still here." I was. And I wasn't leaving. The moment he pinned me beneath him, everything else disappeared. The apartment, the game sounds in the background, the knowledge that my boyfriend was just down the hall, it all faded into a blur. All that mattered was the heat of his body against mine, the way his weight pressed me into the mattress, the way his eyes darkened as he looked down at me. I should have been scared. I should have been panicked, knowing how close we had come to getting caught. But instead, all I felt was the dizzying rush of adrenaline, the fire that burned beneath my skin. His fingers traced along my jaw, slow and deliberate, before tilting my chin up. "Your heart is racing," he murmured. I swallowed hard, my breath uneven. "Yours isn't?" He smirked. "Oh, it is." His lips brushed mine, teasing, barely touching. I arched toward him instinctively, chasing the kiss before I could stop myself. But just as I moved, he pulled back, his smirk deepening. "Not afraid anymore?" he asked, his voice low, teasing. I wasn't sure when the fear had turned into something else, something darker, something far more dangerous. But I knew I wasn't afraid. "Not even a little," I whispered. His hand moved down my body, slow, his fingers grazing over my stomach before resting on my hip. His grip tightened, just slightly, just enough to make me aware of how close he was. I could feel everything. I exhaled sharply, my hand sliding up his arms, over his shoulders, pulling him down just a little more. His lips finally met mine again, but this time, there was no hesitation. It was deeper, hungrier, like we had passed the point of no return. My fingers tangled in his hair as I kissed him back, losing myself in the way he felt, the way he tasted. He groaned against my mouth, his grip on my hip tightening. I gasped as he shifted, pressing me further into the mattress, his body molding against mine like we belonged this way. And then, another sound. A voice. My boyfriend's voice. I stiffened instantly, my entire body going rigid beneath him. Jason didn't move right away. His eyes met mine, steady, unshaken, as if he was waiting to see what I would do. My pulse pounded in my ears as I listened. Footsteps. Coming closer. Jason's fingers tightened on my hip. Stay still, he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. I didn't move. The footsteps hesitated outside the door. I stopped breathing. The doorknob turned. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps retreated. Silence stretched between us. My chest rose and fell rapidly, my breath shallow, my body still frozen beneath his. Jason exhaled slowly, a lazy, wicked smirk curving his lips. That was close, he murmured. I let out a shaky breath. Too close. His fingers traced down my arm, sending a fresh wave of heat through me. And yet, he whispered, his lips brushing my jaw, you still don't want to leave. I swallowed hard, my nails digging into his back. Because he was right. I didn't. Jason's smirk lingered, his breath warm against my skin. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my pulse erratic from how close we had come to being caught. The weight of him on top of me, the heat radiating between us, the way his fingers tightened on my hip, it was all too much. I should have taken that near miss as a warning. I should have pulled away, straightened my clothes, and walked back down the hall like nothing had happened. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, my body betraying me, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Jason studied me, his dark eyes tracing over my face, taking in every flicker of hesitation, every unspoken thought that crossed my mind. He knew what I was thinking before I could even form the words. You're not leaving, he murmured, his voice a quiet confirmation rather than a question. I swallowed hard. No. His smirk deepened. Good. His hands moved, sliding up my sides, his touch burning through the thin fabric of my shirt. My breath hitched as his fingers brushed the edge of my ribs, teasing, just enough to make me arch into him. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against my collarbone, his touch deliberate, calculated. You like this, he whispered. The risk. The fact that he could have opened that door and seen everything. I shivered. He wasn't wrong. Jason exhaled a quiet laugh, his mouth moving up my neck, pressing soft, lingering kisses along my jaw. I can feel it, he murmured against my skin. You're still shaking. I let out a shaky breath, my fingers curling into the sheets beneath me, trying to ground myself. But Jason wasn't making it easy. He pressed down just slightly, his body molding against mine, the weight of him sending a fresh wave of heat through me. Tell me to stop, he whispered. I opened my mouth, but the words never came. Instead, my hand slid up his back, gripping him just a little tighter. Jason hummed in satisfaction. That's what I thought. The moment stretched between us, thick and charged, the only sound in the room our uneven breathing, the distant hum of the video game still playing in the living room. For a second, I wondered if my boyfriend had any idea. If some part of him could sense what was happening just down the hall. The thought should have made me stop. But instead, I pulled Jason down into another kiss, sinking deeper into the very thing that could ruin me. The moment my lips met Jason's again, everything else melted away. The fear, the hesitation, the fleeting thought of my boyfriend sitting just down the hall, it all vanished, drowned beneath the heat of his body against mine, the way his hands roamed my skin with slow, deliberate intent. I wasn't supposed to be here. But I didn't want to be anywhere else. Jason groaned softly, his fingers tightening on my waist as he deepened the kiss, his body pressing more firmly against mine. I gasped, my back arching slightly into him, my hands gripping his shoulders, desperate to pull him closer. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his dark eyes searching mine. "This is insane," I whispered, my breath shaky. Jason smirked, tilting his head. "And yet, here we are." His fingers traced down my side, his touch light, teasing, making me shiver beneath him. His hands knew exactly where to press, where to linger, like he had been waiting for this moment for far too long. And maybe he had. Maybe I had, too. The realization sent another rush of heat through me. His lips brushed against my ear. "Do you regret it?" I should have said yes. I should have at least pretended to feel guilty. But instead, I tangled my fingers into his hair, pulling him down into another kiss. Jason chuckled against my mouth, his hands gripping my hips, pulling me tighter against him. That's what I thought. The weight of him pressed me deeper into the mattress, the warmth of his body making it impossible to think. My breath came in quick, uneven bursts, my heart racing against my ribs. Somewhere in the distance, the game continued. My boyfriend was still awake, still unaware. I should have stopped. But Jason's hands moved lower, his lips trailing down my neck, his breath hot and teasing, and stopping was the last thing on my mind. Jason's hands burned against my skin, his touch lingering in ways that sent shivers through me, making my breath hitch. I was completely lost in him, his weight pressing me into the mattress, his lips ghosting over my jaw, down my throat, teasing, testing how far I was willing to let this go. And the answer was clear. I wasn't stopping. I had already made my choice the second I stepped out of my room, the second I slipped through his door, the second I let my lips meet his without hesitation. There was no undoing this. No pretending it hadn't happened. And I didn't want to. Jason's fingers gripped my waist tighter, his lips brushing my collarbone as he exhaled softly. His breath was warm, steady, and in that moment, he felt more real to me than anything else. "You're not thinking about him, are you?" he murmured against my skin. I sucked in a sharp breath, my hands tightening in his hair. He wasn't wrong. I hadn't thought about my boyfriend in what felt like forever. Not in the way I should have. Not with guilt. Not with hesitation. Because the truth was, this moment, this feeling, the way Jason's touch set fire to every nerve in my body, I hadn't felt this alive in a long time. Jason chuckled under his breath, sensing my silence, his fingers dragging along my ribs, slow and teasing. "Thought so." His lips found mine again, deeper this time, more certain. There was no more hesitation between us. No more restraint. I could feel the way his body tensed beneath my fingertips, the quiet groan that rumbled in his chest as I pressed closer. I was drowning in him. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew how reckless this was. I knew that at any moment, my boyfriend could stand up from the couch, stretch his arms, and decide to check on me. I knew that if he so much as walked down the hall, the light from the TV would illuminate the gap under Jason's door, and he'd realize I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I should have been afraid. But instead, the thought made my pulse race even more. Jason must have felt the way I tensed beneath him, the way my breathing picked up, because he smirked against my lips. "You like it," he murmured. "The risk. The fact that he could find us." I couldn't answer. I didn't need to. Jason's fingers trailed down my side, slow and knowing. "I could stop," he whispered. He wouldn't. And I wouldn't let him. Instead, I hooked my leg around his waist, pulling him closer, pressing myself against him so there was no space left between us. Jason exhaled sharply, his grip on me tightening, his control slipping just slightly. I wanted him to lose control. I wanted him to forget the rules the same way I had. And in that moment, I knew, we had already gone too far. There was no turning back now. Jason's breath was ragged, his body tense against mine. Every touch, every press of his fingers into my skin felt like a claim, like he was marking me in ways that couldn't be undone. I wasn't sure when the guilt would hit me, if it ever would. Right now, all I could feel was him. The world outside this moment had completely disappeared. The walls, the apartment, the reality of my boyfriend sitting just down the hall, it all faded into nothing. Jason's lips traced a slow, dangerous path down my neck, lingering just long enough to make my stomach tighten, to make me dig my nails into his back. He groaned softly, his breath warm against my skin. "You're not afraid anymore." I wasn't. Because it was too late. I had made my choice. The second I had walked through that door, I had decided. And Jason knew it, too. His hands tightened on my hips, his forehead resting against mine as he caught his breath. His fingers skimmed the hem of my shirt again, his touch hesitant for the first time. Not because he was unsure, but because he wanted me to make the next move. He was still giving me an out. Still waiting for me to pull away, to stop this before we crossed the last line. I lifted my gaze to his, my heart hammering inside my chest. He looked at me like he already knew my answer. I exhaled shakily and reached for his wrist, sliding his hand beneath my shirt, pressing it against my bare skin. Jason let out a quiet curse under his breath, his grip tightening. And just like that, the hesitation was gone. His lips crashed against mine again, hungrier this time, more desperate, like he had been waiting too long to let himself have this moment. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel him against me in every way possible. I had never felt like this before, never felt this much heat, this much reckless abandon. I had spent so long being careful. So long doing what was right, what was expected. But here, with Jason, I didn't have to be careful. I could just want. I gasped as he pressed me further into the mattress, his body covering mine completely, the weight of him sending another pulse of heat through me. My hand slid over his back, memorizing every inch of him, my nails dragging lightly against his skin. Jason groaned against my mouth, his hands roaming lower, gripping my thighs as he pulled me against him. The sound of the video game in the living room felt like a distant echo now, like a separate world I no longer belonged to. And then, a sound. Not from outside. From inside the room. Jason froze. My breath caught in my throat. A vibration. A light illuminating the darkness. My phone. On the nightstand. Ringing. I turned my head just enough to see the name flashing across the screen. My boyfriend. The realization hit like a slap to the face, sending a cold rush through my veins. Jason was still pressed against me, still holding me, his breath uneven as he watched my reaction. His grip on me didn't loosen, but I felt the shift, the awareness settling in. The phone buzzed again. A choice. I could answer. Walk away. Pretend this never happened. Or. I met Jason's gaze again. And without a word, I reached for the phone. And flipped it over, silencing the call. Jason exhaled slowly, a lazy, knowing smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "You're really not stopping," he murmured. I wasn't. And as I pulled him back down to me, I realized, there was no going back now. Not ever.